Everybody, thanks to you all for coming. My name is Eric Lindquist. I am a history and humanities librarian here at McKeldin Library. The library's Speaking of Books series, of which today's event is a part, was established 12 years ago. A number of us in the library saw that many faculty members were writing and publishing interesting books, but did not always have a forum on campus to talk about them. The purpose of our series is to provide that forum. In the 12 years since it has started, about 50 faculty authors have participated in the Speaking of Books forum. Many people have contributed over the years to the success of the series. I'd like to acknowledge those who have helped put on today's event: Eric Barteld, Rebecca Wilson of the Communications Office, Kelsey Corlett Rivera, and Brittany DeGrail from the Research Commons, and the staff of User and System Support. I would also like to thank the University Bookstore, which has long been a supporter of Speaking of Books by providing books for sale. Today, the bookstore representative is TJ. Please buy a book from him. We want him to return empty-handed to the bookstore. Above all, of course, I want to thank our speaker, Nancy Raquel Mirabal. Professor Mirabal is Associate Professor of American Studies and Director of the U.S. Latina and Latino Studies program at the university. She is also on the advisory board for the Center for Global Migrations and an affiliate of the Department of Women's Studies, the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity, and the Center for Latin American Studies. She received her bachelor's degree in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in history from the University of Michigan in 2001. She taught for a number of years at San Francisco State University before coming to the University of Maryland in 2014. Professor Mirabal has compiled an impressive scholarly record. She has published essays in numerous collections, including American Dreaming, Global Realities, Rethinking U.S. Immigration History, Neither Enemies Nor Friends, Latinos, Blacks, Afro-Latinos, Mambo Montage, The Latinization of New York, and Voices of Women Historians. She is co-editor of Techno Futuros, Critical Interventions in Latino and Latino Studies, and of the forthcoming Keywords in Latino and Latino Studies. Today she will be talking about her new book, Suspect Freedoms, The Racial and Sexual Politics of Cubanidad in New York, 1823 to 1957, published earlier this year by New York University Press. To quote the description of the book on her department webpage, Suspect Freedoms, quote, is the first book to explore the history of Cuban racial and sexual politics in New York during the 19th and 20th centuries. It's chronicling more than 100 years of Cuban exile, migration, and diasporic history. Suspect Freedoms situates this pivotal era within larger theoretical discussions of potential future visibility and belonging, demonstrating how these transformations complicated meanings of territoriality, gender, race, power, and labor. After Professor Mirabal speaks, there will be time for questions and discussion and also signing books. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mirabal.
So thank you for coming. I know it's really a busy time, so I appreciate everyone being here. And I also really want to thank Eric. The publicity on this event was pretty amazing. I was telling Eric I felt like I was in a science fiction movie. I kept seeing myself everywhere, and I was like, no! But it was, you were with me in one of those moments, I believe. So thank you so much. I also want to thank the University of Maryland Libraries to be part of this wonderful series. I really am deeply honored to be here. To Kate Keene, to Julie Green, for the Center for Global Migration Studies for co-sponsoring this event. And I also want to thank Christopher Perez, yes, for putting this on Twitter and also supporting this talk and this event. I thank you so much. And also Pat Heron, who I met today, and I really appreciate your time. So I know it takes a lot of people to put an event together, so I'm really very thankful. And as I would say, to begin, I'm going to say something that most authors don't say or most scholars don't say, but this book took a long time to write. And I say that because we're not supposed to say that. But it did. And it was a book that was constantly in process. And I tell folks that as I was writing this book, I was learning how to write it. As I was doing research, I was learning how to write it. There was no one way to actually write this book. And the reason for this is because this is a history of ideas. It's not necessarily a history of community. And people say, oh, it's a history of the Afro-Cuban community or the African-American community or the Cuban community. And actually, when I finished the book, I realized this is really a history of ideas. And that central idea is this notion of Cubanidad and what it meant to be Cuban during certain times in history. What did it mean to be Cuban when the island was under Spanish control, when it was under Spanish colonial control? What did it mean to be Cuban during a time of independence or emancipation or enfranchisement or under US intervention? And so forth. So that I started thinking as I was writing this that it really, at the heart of this book, is an idea. And the idea of utopia and what it means. And the reason the title is Suspect Freedoms is that idea didn't always measure up for everybody. Right? So I wanted to begin this talk with a friend of mine. Believe it or not, I got a call from a colleague about 2 days ago who said, I just really want to talk about your book. I said, okay. And so he called me, and he's a professor at UC Irvine. And he said, I read your book, and I really want to talk about it. I also write about things that no one has ever read about. There's a lot in this book that has never been published, photos that's never been published. And so I also argue that this book is almost unthinkable. It's unknowable, right? And how difficult it was to actually bring that into fruition. So my colleague was telling me, I think this book is about Cuba. And I said, well, okay. He said, no, this book is about Cuba. It just happens to take place in New York. And I thought, well, that's about right? Because oftentimes when we think about U.S. history, we have these artificial boundaries of what is U.S. history. U.S. history begins at this moment, it ends at this time, this is how the United States looks like, this is what immigration looks like, and you can write this book or actually think about this research if you just limit yourself with those paradigms. And so what I was saying to him, I said, what's interesting is that in a way it is Cuba, because as I was writing the book, Jose Marti, who's like the George Washington for Cuba, right, the airport in La Habana is named after Jose Marti. The National Archive is named after Jose Marti. In fact, we have a saying among Cubans, que son más cubano que Jose Marti. Like, that's more Cuban than Jose Marti. Nothing is more Cuban than Jose Marti. He is about as Cuban as it gets. Well, Jose Marti spent 15 years in New York. He spent most of his time writing and thinking and being a scholar, not in Cuba, but actually in New York. And he published his most important pieces, whether it's Nuestra America, this idea of our America in 1891 in New York. And he was influenced by what was taking place at that particular time in U.S. history. So he was influenced by, the U.S.-Mexican War, what was happening to the indigenous communities, what was happening in Chicago, the labor strikes. And so in many ways, I always found that to be incredibly interesting. The Cuban flag that we see everywhere was actually first stitched and flown in New York. And then 8 days later, it was taken to the island. So these, and most of the intellectuals and the writers were actually doing this work in New York. They were writing for many of the newspapers. Many of the newspapers that I used to write this book were written and published in New York. So in many ways, the history of Cuba, you could say that, but it's also a history of forcing us to think about territoriality, diaspora, and also periodization. So I thought that was a great, never in my wildest dream was I thought I was gonna get a colleague to call me and want to talk about my book. So that was great. So there's 3 points that I wanted to bring up, and then I'm going to show some images because images ended up being really important to this particular project. So the way that I start the book is, why did I write this book? Well, I wrote this book, sometimes I feel like the book wrote me, but I wrote this book because it was a book that I wanted to read, but I also felt like it was a book that I had no choice but to write. And I first started as a graduate student. And I remember, and I tell this story often, that I went to the Schomburg, and I said the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at New York Public Library. And it was a summer, and I went to the archivists, who are now my very dear friends, but at that time I was a nobody. They were just like, oh, get away from me. And I said, I don't have any sources on women. I'm writing this history, and I don't have any sources on Afro-Cuban women. And they said, well, there's this woman that you might want to talk to. Her name is Mel Alvarado. You can talk to her. She might talk to you. She's very active in the community. Good luck. So, okay. So they gave me the phone number. This was before any of this like email or Twitter. You had to call people, cold call them and so forth. And so I called her and I said, hi, my name is so-and-so and can I interview you? And she said, yeah, sure, whatever. Come on over. This is my address. I'm in the South Bronx. Okay. And I said, all right. So I had all of this equipment. It was this big equipment. Again, this is the 1990s, right? None of this cute little iPhone situation going on. You got and the microphone and so forth, and I'm taking the subway, and I show up, and she's in the club. And I just realized, she looked at me, and she said, I've been waiting for you. And I was like, wow. And I was like, wow, I'm not that late. And I got here, and she's like, no. You're going to tell my story. And I thought, oh, man. So we ended up having over a 20-year relationship. And so Melba Alvarado was an incredibly interesting person because it was through her that I understood this history. So this photo, for instance, and I write about her, and I write about this photo in the first chapter, which is about archival hauntings, is the first. So archival hauntings, right? How archives haunt us. Because this photo, she kept telling me, in Spanish, of course, there was this club. And she said, mira, antes que tú hagas cualquier cosa, before you do anything, right, in that Cuban accent, tú tienes que saber de esto, right? So, all right, there was this club, and it was called El Club Julio Antonio Mella. And the club was, and she's like, and the club was on this, and it was racially integrated in the 1930s, and blah, blah, blah. And that's what started the club that I'm the president of now, El Club Cubano Interamericano. Good luck. I said, good luck. So go find it. I'll find it. So that club, this one right here, didn't exist anywhere. And so that's when I began to theorize this idea of the unthinkable, but also the unknowable. And it wasn't anywhere in El Club Cubano Interamericano records, she was the president of this club, which was formed in the South Bronx in 1945. And it was an Afro-Cuban club. She didn't tell me why it was formed, why people got together, none of this. So one day, and this was years, I'm looking for this club. I can't find this club anywhere. And so I'm looking in the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, which is a great archive, by the way. And this picture is misfiled. And I said, oh, this is why it's good to get your hands dirty in the archive and open up a couple of boxes once in a while. So I looked at this photo, I read it, and I was just like, wow. And so I write about how had Melba not kept telling me about El Club Julio Antonio Mella, I would have just put it somewhere else. So who's Julio Antonio Mella? Julio Antonio Mella is one of the founders of the Communist Party in Cuba in 1929. And so you look at it and you're like, okay, Julio Antonio Mella is a founder of the Communist Party in Cuba. He is forced out as a result of a Machadato, Gerardo Machado, who's president at the time. He goes to Mexico. He hangs out with Tina Mondari, who's this beautiful, you know who she is, photographer, and just like, she would be like the Kardashian of today. So Tina Mondari was very famous, and he was beautiful. If you ever like Google his name, oh my God, Julio Antonio Mella. And so they're together in Mexico. They're meeting with all kinds of organizers, labor leaders, and he gets killed. He's killed, he's assassinated. And he's assassinated in 1929. And so this club was formed in honor of him. And it's a lodge of the IWO, the International Workers' Order. And so the moment I realized, International Workers' Order, Logia Julio Antonio Mella, then I realized there's something to the story that she's not telling me. And what she was not telling me was that this was a communist club. And she's not telling me this because if you do the history of Cubans, anything having to do with socialism and communism is dangerous, right? It could be treacherous. And so when I came back with this photo and I said, oye, tú no me dijiste que esta gente eran comunista, you didn't tell me these people were communists. She goes, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you that. Forgot to tell you that. So I always tell this story because in many ways, this photo really started me thinking about how do I theorize this particular project. And so no one had ever heard about this club, no one had written about this club, and then I realized, okay, I have to do a different kind of writing. And the first thing that I ended up having to do was to challenge periodization. So if you look at the history of Cubans in the US, it always begins like 1898 with the US intervention in Cuba, and then nothing happens until the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And you're like, okay, so what happened in between? And so this book is really the in-between. What happens before 1898? What happens before 1868? So it goes as far back as 1823, and it ends in 1957. And believe me, I was like, I kept like, I gotta stop here. First it was 45, 47. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna stop right here. But it kept going. I did 3 formal interviews with Alvarado, and 1 to be archived at the Schomburg. And we also took a lot of her records and so forth, and we archived in the Schomburg. So for future scholars and researchers, that work is there. So when I changed the periodization and said, look, I'm going to look at the period before, I'm going to look in the middle, and so forth, it forced me to rethink what this history was all about. And I realized that I couldn't write about Afro-Cubans and white Cubans, that I had to write about an idea, and there's this idea called Cubanidad. And so in the 1820s, and also when you're looking at your research, in the 1830s and 1840s, who you have coming to the United States at that time from Cuba are really the wealthy elites. And the wealthy elites are coming into New York, and they're organizing to end Spanish colonial rule. But there's still slavery in Cuba. And so the idea is, we don't necessarily want to get rid of slavery. We would like to maybe have Cuba be annexed to the United States so we can expand slavery to the island. But what did that mean for them? And so the idea of whiteness became an obsession. And if you study Caribbean history, the idea of whiteness, especially in a period where we saw the Haitian Revolution and the beginning of many of the rise of slavery and slave plantations, the concept of whiteness ends up having a lot of currency. So there was a chapter where I talked about the impossibility of Cuban diasporic whiteness. These were people who thought of themselves as white, organized around whiteness, but couldn't do that around the United States. There was also a movement called blancamiento at this time, which was the idea of whitening. And so I thought about diasporic blancamiento and how these Cubans were coming to the United States and thinking about these questions of whiteness. And so let me read you a little something, because I kind of go back and forth. So this is a newspaper, and this is what I talk about, looking at your sources and having to theorize your sources. So I came across a newspaper called La Verdad, which is in the New York Historical Society. And everything's in Spanish, and I've had to translate them. But it says here, we consider a Cuban every person born in Cuba, and what we wish is that white people be born by thousands every hour. And that's in 1848. So how do you theorize that? How do you think about those questions? So I realized that in many respects, Cubanidad, this idea, begins to shift. What's fascinating is that African Americans at this time, especially in the North, are fascinated with Cuba. And people like Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnett, are literally organizing around Cuban independence and ending slavery in Cuba. So I was looking at the black press, and they were taking a close look at Cuba because they thought if the United States annexes this island to expand slavery, that would be a huge problem for us, right? And so in the book, there's this back and forth of the discussion. So it's African Americans kind of looking at what is going to be the independence of Cuba. What is that going to mean for us as a hemispheric potential? And then there's the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878. That was was Cuba's attempt to get its independence. It lasted 10 years. It had an amazing impact. And it's in 1868 that the migrations of Cubans to the United States, thousands, leave. And many of them are Afro-Cubans. And so that's another point when I looked at periodization, is that when we think of Afro-Cubans, what we think of mostly are baseball players, musicians, right? Folks that are cultural producers. Everybody here knows who Celia Cruz is, and I have a photo of Celia Cruz. We're getting there. But what people don't realize are the writers and the thinkers and the activists. And so Afro-Cubans were themselves thinking, wait, we also belong under this rubric of Cubanidad. And they were labor organizers. And so you had people like Rafael Serra, Martín Moruo Delgado, Sotero Figueroa. And so these were Cubans who come out and they begin to say, okay, if we're going to have this independence that everybody wants, how is emancipation going to look like? What is it going to mean for people of African descent? How does that look like? How does that freedom look like for us? Now that's a history that has been buried. And so as I was looking through a lot of these sources, what you'll get is there's an organization called La Liga de Instrucción y Recreo. It's known as La Liga. And every time someone has mentioned it, they'll say, La Liga was founded by José Martí in 1891. But if you look closely at the sources, José Martí did not form La Liga. La Liga was a club for, what they say, formed for black Cubans or Afro-Cubans. But José Martí never organized that club. That club was organized by Rafael Serra, who himself was Afro-Cuban, who had founded close to 3 to 4 different newspapers, who was an incredible thinker and an activist and an organizer. And it took him close to 7 years just to organize that club because there was so much tension between the white Cubans and the black Cubans around this idea of emancipation and freedom and who gets to be free and how and at what levels. There's also, in 1872, which I talk about also in the book, African Americans organized something called the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society. Often when we think of anti-slavery activists, we don't think of African Americans, right? We think of northern white anti-slavery society folks. But here were African Americans who not organized, who felt like now that we are free, now that we've had emancipation, it is our duty to free other people. And so they organized a club, and in that club there were Afro-Cubans who were that club, there were African Americans, and this is in 1872. So you see that there's a dialogue going back and forth between these particular groups about this idea of freedom. So I'm going to show you some images, and I'm really bad at this. So see, I told you I'm really bad at it. But this is a newspaper, see? Let's see. I don't want to do that. Okay. I'm going to leave it right there. So this is a typical newspaper that would have been published in the 1850s, and it was called El Mulato. So imagine a newspaper in Spanish. Oh, and by the way, in 1823, we had tons of newspapers that were published in Spanish. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And so this one is in, it's like 1854. And so this is a newspaper that's written by exiles, and it's called El Mulato. And the whole newspaper in Spanish is really thinking about this question of race. Just like the United States, Cuba was obsessed of this idea of race, especially after emancipation. Also, we have, let me see, there's so many to choose from. This is Serra. Not a small photo there. There's a bigger photo in the book. But this is Rafael Serra. He spent most of his time in New York. And then this is La Liga. These are the men who were part of La Liga, that organization. And these are Afro-Cuban, Afro-Puerto Rican men in New York who had organized this club, right? And I think when I say it's unthinkable, one of the things that photos show us is that it's unthinkable for us to see, for instance, Afro-Cuban men as political activists, as revolutionaries at this particular period in history. But there were also the women, right? Las señoras de la Liga, who were also organizing, and they were also organizing around changing the idea of what it meant to be a woman, what we would call like feminism today. And also there was also the politics of respectability. Now, Afro-Cuban women published a great deal in this newspaper called Minerva, which was in Cuba. But it was always brought into the United States. So let me show you. Here's Delaney, someone who was very active in terms of Afro-Cuba, the freedom in Cuba, and so forth. So let me go ahead and just, I don't think I brought that other one, but. So, now as we moved to the 19th century, another element that doesn't get discussed quite a bit is that New York was also one of the leading places for the cigar industry, the Cuban cigar industry. We always think of Tampa or we think of Key West. And so the cigar industry, the reason the cigar industry in New York is so huge is because there's a 10 years war on the island. The plantation is being destroyed. There are no tobacco. The factories are being destroyed. And so many of the cigar workers come to New York. And Rafael Serra himself is a cigar worker. And so a part of the nationalist movement that takes place is also the role of cigar workers and laborers. At this time, about 1890s, at the same time that you have La Liga, you have the formation of the PRC, El Partido Revolucionario Cubano. And the reason the PRC is so key is that the PRC is actually the reason it was supposed to raise funds, organize for Cuba's independence in 1898. And so much of the effort was being done in the United States to organize its efforts. And that's when you have someone like Juan Fraga, who worked in Brooklyn, and he was a cigar maker, and he organized around these issues. Now, one of the areas that folks didn't realize was that Afro-Cubans were central to that organizing. And they were not organizing only New York, they were actually going to Jamaica, to Haiti, to Venezuela. They were organizing the entire hemisphere. And in organizing the entire hemisphere, they were forcing, which were usually the elites who owned these cigar factories, to say, look, we need to bring issues of labor, of work, of independence, of freedom into this revolutionary nationalist organization that's going to get freedom in Cuba. And there was a lot of fights back and forth. So Tomás Estrada Palma, who is part of the PRC, he's the leader of the PRC for a time there, he gets into a lot of skirmishes with the Afro-Cuban organizers. He's an elite white Cuban. He is a citizen. He's lived in the United States for 30 years. And if you talk about the connection between Cuba and New York, once the US intervenes in Cuba as a result of the Spanish-American War, and they force the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution, the person that they handpicked to be president of Cuba is Tomás Estrada Palma, who has lived in the United States for 30 years, does not know much about what's going on in Cuba. But he speaks English, and he becomes the favorite. And as a result of him becoming president, then all of these organizers who are literally on the island, like Serra and Martín Moruo Delgado, descend on Cuba. But they have spent most of their organizing in New York. And so they have a certain kind of mentality about diasporic thinking, and they crash once they go into Cuba. There's a real big problem. And it leads to the race war of 1912. In Martín Moruo Delgado, if you know something about Cuban history, he ends up authoring the Moruo Amendment, which was a very controversial amendment, which basically said people of color cannot organize on the basis of race. The PIC gets organized, El Partido Independiente de Color. They go against the Moruo Amendment because he was a legislator at the time, and ends up having a protest. The US Marines and Army are called in, and they shoot and kill many Afro-Cubans, put them in jail, and it's called the Race War of 1912. And the Race War of 1912 ends up silencing a lot of the organizing that takes place. And it silences much of the organizing until the late 1920s, when you have Mella and you have the rise of Gerardo Machado and El Machadato. Okay. This is a lot of history, isn't it? So let me go ahead and just give you some photos. There's so much. So this is Samuel Scotterin. Samuel Scotterin was one of the leaders of the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society in 1872. And he was an inventor and an organizer, a good friend of Booker T. Washington. Rafael Serra and Booker T. Washington were also very good friends. And he's also famously Lena Horne's grandfather in Brooklyn. And this is Henry Highland Garnett, who also was an organizer. And as I was doing my research, I realized that Jose Marti, when he comes to the United States, he actually goes to Henry Highland Garnett's funeral. And Jose Marti is there, and they have this connection. And Maceo, Antonio Maceo, right, the Bronze Titan, who is the general of the 10 Years' War, is also a very good friend of Henry Highland Garnett and Samuel Scotterin. So there's all these connections that are taking place. So by the 1920s and the 1930s, let me go ahead and, is when we get the beginning of El Club Julio Antonio Mella. And so as many Cubans, so the Machadato, there was someone by the name of Gerardo Machado, he's in Cuba. There is a moment of organizing around labor, around communism, and he basically shuts everybody down, puts people in prison, extends the Constitution, is incredibly oppressive, And as a result, you get one of the largest migrations coming out of Cuba to the United States. And this is about the late 1920s and 30s. And the way to remember this is also kind of a time when you see musicians like Mario Bauza coming out, Arsenio Rodriguez comes out, Chano Pozo, that music, many of these are Afro-Cubans, and they leave the island because it's so repressive. And this was one of the clubs that was organized, which is Julio Antonio Mella. And this is one of my favorite photos. So this is the Club de Damas that I found, and Julio Antonio Mella. So who were these people? The club started in 1932. In 1940 it ends, it gets merged with other logias and other clubs, and they were also very active in the Spanish Civil War. And so these were folks who, the men in this club, who actually go off to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War against Franco. And that's when I began to look at a lot of the research. I looked at the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, and you see all of these names that folks had never really heard of. And so there was one of my favorites. I'll tell you a quick story of Basilio Cuellar y Obrit. I love that name. It is the strangest name in any language, English or Spanish. And Basilio Cuellar y Obrit was a baseball player. So he leaves Cuba to play baseball in the United States, and he plays in the southern states. And then he leaves baseball, and he goes up to Long Island, decides then to go to New York. And he is a pretty revolutionary figure, and he ends up becoming a member of El Club Mella. He organizes around El Club Mella, and then he goes off to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and then he comes back as a decorated veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and is then one of the founders of El Club Cubano Interamericano. Right? But that's a story that unless you dig and research, you're not going to find it. And so many of these women, the Club de Damas here was also one that was part of the IWO, but also the Cervantes Fraternal Society, which was part of the IWO. And the IWO was organizing immigrants, and mostly Spanish-speaking immigrants, and this was one of the lodges that they organized. And these women, as I say, as I was reading their stories and I write about them, especially Josefina Cepeda, are incredible feminists, and they challenge everything that is being presented to them. They want to work. They don't necessarily want to have children right away. They don't see themselves as necessarily having to be married. They come together because they find that they need to have their space to organize. And I also think it's really important to realize that these are Afro-Cuban women as organizers, as revolutionaries. Right? We don't see that in many respects. So this is a particular part of the history that was really key. And let me see. I'm going to go ahead. There's so many images to show. Okay. Oh, this is Tomás Estrada Palma. This was the first president of Cuba. What's interesting about Tomás Estrada Palma is that he becomes the first president of Cuba, and he's so disinterested that he doesn't even show up for his own inauguration. And he's like, he's like, yeah, I'll get there. And so he shows up, I think, like a week late for his own inauguration in Cuba. And most of it was because he was a figurehead. And he was seen as a figure that ended up really betraying the ideals of Cubanidad and supporting the U.S. Now, when the U.S. goes into Cuba at this time, just to backtrack a little bit, they do several things. And there's one chapter, it's called The Orphans. Let me see, orphan politics, because Ludlow, who's the general, literally declares Cuba an orphan state. Now in Cuba, they're all orphans, right? Because it can never be independent. It has to be under either Spanish or the U.S. And so the idea was to control Cuba. And one of the things that they did do was to, and Estrada Palma was supportive of this, as was Ludlow, is to begin to have racial segregation on the island. And so you see the rise of segregation in that particular island. Okay. Now, as we look at the 20s and the 30s, I'll read you some to give you a sense of this period. And I want to make sure to leave time for questions. Oh, okay. So this is Pablo de la Torriente Brau. He's a writer. Comes out. He's a good friend of Julio Antonio Mella. And he says, and I love this quote, he says, "We are the most revolutionary in New York. We, the Latin American revolutionaries who have emigrated here, forced out of our countries, persecuted by an imperialism that by its own internal contradictions tolerates us here, where we agitated meetings in the revolutionary press, in their clubs, and in societies. And then Cesar Fuentes, who is part of the Hispanic section of the IWO, says, I'll repeat what I've said in previous conferences. Our section was founded by radical elements, and it is therefore necessary and natural that our section be organized in a way that expresses those same opinions and sentiments. And so they begin to organize. One of the things that takes place, of course, is the Red Scare. The IWO, so El Grupo Maya ends in 1940, the IWO ends in 1954, but in 1945, there are still some Afro-Cubans who had some connection to El Grupo Maya who organized, and one of the things that they begin to organize is around Marcel. This is the general, the Afro-Cuban general of the 10 Years' War, and this was an event that they had in 1945. And this event, again, this is all through the oral histories, and then I have to go and look and find the research to make sure that this was all true. If you look at it, if you can just think of the people who were going to speak that day. You have Fulgencio Batista, who was the president of Cuba in the 30s and then later in the 50s. He was the one that was pushed out by Fidel Castro. You have Jesus Colon, who's a labor organizer, communist in the Puerto Rican community. And you have Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, right? So these are people who were all in conversation at that particular time. And if you know anything about music, Marcelino Guerra was like the biggest thing at that time. And so was Eusebia Cosme, very big Afro-Cuban actress, poet, writer. Tony Lopez writes a great deal about her work. So this was an event that was taking place in West 43rd Street. And many of the Afro-Cubans who had organized around Cruz Julio Antonio Mella after World War II decided we needed to have a club. And so they organized this, a commemoration to Marcel. Now Marcel ends up having huge meanings for Afro-Cubans. And the problem with this particular event is that white Cubans didn't want anything to do with it. And so they have this particular commemoration, and there again we have a rethinking of Cubanidad. If this is the general of the war, if this is someone who represents Cuba, for Afro-Cubans who's about as important as Jose Marti, why will you not organize around this? So a few months later, in September of 1945, is when Afro-Cubans come together and they create El Club Cubano Interamericano, the CCI, which is what Melba, who I interviewed in the beginning, was the president of twice. So this is the beginning, and so El Club Cubano Interamericano actually begins as a result of the separation and the racism among Cubans post-World War II. And it was very painful, and so for her, she would look at El Club Maya and she said, look, back then in the 1930s, Cubans were racially integrated, they were organizing together, why are we separated now? And that was a question that the last chapter investigates. And so just to finish, the last chapter, one of the things that the members of the club wanted to do was that they wanted to set up a monument to Maceo in New York. And it wasn't far-fetched, right? Because LaGuardia had gotten 6th Avenue in New York and said, this is going to be the street where we're going to have statues of all these Latin American leaders. And so Afro-Cubans were like, great, our moment to put Maceo. And so they organized for about 10 years in putting in Maceo. And this photo was a coup, by the way. A lot of these photos were actually in Melba Varado's collections. And it took me 2 years to get permission to get those photos because she hadn't done anything. So I had to go to the Schomburg, sign, and then you have to do your due diligence. If you ever want to know how to get a photo published, come see me. I can help you. So this particular photo, I think, is incredible because it is members of CCI, El Club Cubano Interamericano, and if you can see up there, I suppose we have like this little dot thing. Does that work? They said I could use it. Oh, there it is. See right there? It's El Monumento Martí Maceo. So when I first started telling people about this story that I said in the last chapter, no one believed me. They're like, what? They want to do a monument to Maceo? And I said, yes. They wanted to write a monument to Maceo, but they couldn't get it built. So they said, okay, how about Maceo and Martí? And so this was the monument to Maceo and Martí. And so let me go ahead and show you some images of the club itself. This is one of my favorites. So this is El Club Cubano Interamericano. Many of the founders were members of El Julio Antonio Mella, but because Mella, that particular club was radical, communist, associated with the IWO, it was erased from the archive. You do not find that name anywhere in the archive. And then in related, for their bylaws, their first rule on their bylaws is this club is not political. You cannot talk about politics in this club, and you cannot talk about religion. And it had to go with the Red Scare, but also this idea of Afro-Cubans being savage, less than, their politics and santeria. So you see the politics of respectability here being dressed up. But my favorite is, here's Maceo, right? Here's Jose Marti. You wonder how he looked like. Here's Simon Bolivar, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln, right? And so this idea of this diasporic connection that goes back many, many years. And here's another one that I promised you. And we see the same thing. We see the escudo. What is the escudo en inglés? ¿Cómo se dice?
Coat of arms.
Coat of arms, yeah, see? Simón Bolívar, and there's Jose Martí, and there's George Washington, and there's Abraham. I don't know why they do this all the time. But what's interesting is this is Melba, my friend Melba, and this is Celia Cruz.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is her friend too. And this is Eusebia Cosme, who I talked about earlier. And the reason that Celia Cruz is in this club is that in the 1940s and the 1950s, there were no areas, or very few clubs, Miriam Jimenez Roman writes about this, where Afro-Cubans could perform and other Afro-Cubans could see them. It was segregated, it was racially segregated. So this club becomes one of the few places where you're gonna have the best in Cuban music, Mario Bauza, Machito, all of these people performing to Cubans, because they could perform in clubs in New York, but the audiences were white. And here's another event that shows you, it's loading, but I'm not sure what's going on there. There you go. But you could tell they're having a hell of a good time, right? And again, this is also unimaginable because the idea is that Cubans arrive after 1959. And here, so the Cuban Club gets organized as a result of organizing by Maceo and so forth. They also are a club that, let me go. They're also a club that gives insurance, health benefits, they help each other, they have sewing classes, English classes. It becomes really important. And it begins in 45, and it exists to this day. So this is another one. Anybody here music lovers on Cuban music? Anybody can tell me who this person is?
Benny More.
Benny More. ¿Cómo tú sabes?
Juana.
Wow, ya tú sabes. We got a Cuban in the house. There we go. That's an incredible photo, you know? And so Benny More, he dies very early in his life, comes to the CCI, and I talk about the book that Benny More was Melba Alvarado's favorite performer. She loved Benny More, right? She loved him. And she always used to say, tú sabes, yo fui la que traje Benny More al club. You know, I was the one who brought him to the club. And, you know, she was always, and you could see she's ecstatic, where she's right there, right behind Benny More. So these are really rare photos to see this particular club. And I'm going to see if I have, this is another one. Uh-oh, ¿qué pasó? There we go, doesn't want to show. So this is with Arsenio Rodriguez. So if you know anything about Cuban music, Arsenio Rodriguez is credited with the mambo, right? With coming up with the mambo. Sorry, he's up there, and he's there with Eusebia Cosme. So let me see. We had some little issues with the. Here's another one. Oh, it doesn't want to cut it. Okay. I'm not sure what's happening. But anyway, this right here, Socaraz, is a flutist. He's very important, and they're raising money for the particular. Let me see. Can I get that one? Oh. Yeah, it's just acting up. Can I do this one? Okay. So, so with the particular of that Martín Maceo, and there's images, they actually got the bust, they're raising money in Cuba, but at the end of the day, they were never able to get Maceo built. And at the end of the day, when you go to 6th Avenue and you end up in Central Park, what you get is only a statue of Jose Martí. And so there was this uneasy, right, visibility, the inability. So I always say that the last chapter is, and I'll just read a little bit and then I'm done. Because, I don't know, because I want to. All these photos right here. So the press said, you get 17 photos, and I took it all. But one section is like the short history and the long memory of the unbuilding. And there's in the club records in 1949, they're so excited. They say, considering all the work that the Committee Pro Monumento has completed, we can be assured that very soon we will see our efforts converted into reality. And for this, they, the Cuban government, congratulates us all. They were so sure that Maceo and Martí was going to be built, right? And then Melba Alvarado says, it was never possible for us to put Maceo anywhere. Nowhere, don't you see? And to this day, there is no, there are no statues, there are no monuments to Maceo. And Maceo was so critical. I always tell folks, if you ever wonder how important, Maceo was also really important to the African American community. And Maceo becomes a really popular name among African Americans. So, let me see this. At the corner of the 59th Street and Avenue of the Americas at Central Park South, there is a grand and majestic sculpture of Jose Martí. Made of bronze, the large and imposing statue depicts Martí on horseback at the very moment he is killed in battle. If you go there, you'll see it. Sculpted by the renowned artist Anna von Hyde Huntington, it was completed in 1959 when she was 82. Hyde Huntington gifted the statue to the Cuban government for presentation to the people of New York. In return, the Cuban government donated the monument's dark granite pedestal. Although completed in 1959, the political climate between pro- and anti-Castro elements in New York necessitated the delay of the monument's unveiling until 1965. This story, however, is not about the breathtaking monument to Jose Martí or to the reasons why it was unveiled 6 years after being completed. It is about the other monument, the one that was never built. The archive reveals little about why the monument to Antonio Maceo, later to Jose Martí and Antonio Maceo, was never built. There are no answers, only reasons: financial burden, lack of organization, political instability, and little cooperation. There is even less to suggest that the statue of Jose Martí in Central Park was even related to the one that the CCI worked so hard to build. But there is talk, and those discussions in people's homes, at events, and over dinner recall painful memories that for some are better left unstirred, while for others beg to be told. And so that was really part of the work, that when I began to interview many of the old members, they really wanted to tell this story. And so it ends there, and that's it. So I'll take any questions. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about Cubanidad. You mentioned that it is sort of this mindset about what it means to be Cuban and how it encompassed everyone. Does it sort of still have sway? Like, is it an idea that most Cubans would still recognize today?
Oh, absolutely. So Cubanidad is a really complicated idea, and Cubanidad basically means independence. It also meant racial equality. It also has a diasporic meaning that's very different from the island. And then once you have the Cuban Revolution, for instance, there's another meaning of Cubanidad, which is one that is independent from U.S. interests and U.S. control. So to be Cuban. So Cubanidad is this idea of being Cuban. But in many respects, it fails at some level, especially during the earlier periods. It fails to include everybody. So the reason that I organized it around this idea was that it allowed me to write about race in a much more complicated way. And so I just remembered that I had a wonderful advisor, Elsa Barkley Brennan, who said to me when I was a graduate student, she said, you know, people of color always lived among everybody else. And you cannot write history as though people live these separate lives. And that made a huge influence, because the only reason you have Afro-Cubans is because you have Cubans who want to define themselves as white. You can't have one without the other. And so that these ideas, and so most Afro-Cubans, if you were to go back to the 19th century, early 20th century and say, are you Afro-Cuban? They would say, no, I'm Cuban. I'm Cuban. But it was really the idea, kind of the racism that permeated, the idea of white privilege, all of these things that forced Cubans. For instance, that's why Melba was so nostalgic about the Club Julio Antonio Mella, because she said, look, there's this one place where Cubans of all backgrounds, colors, they were organizing around politics. And race didn't seem to matter. But by the time the CC comes around, race seems to matter. And she tells this one story in the book where they had an event at Carnegie Hall to celebrate Jose Marti and Maceo. And so the white club was called El Club Atenas. And so they were doing their best, and they had, she's like, we spent all our money. We went out. This woman loved to dance and party. We went all out. And she was telling the story about how on the stage there was a place for the members of El Club Atenas, which was a white Cuban club, to come together. Because the idea of Marti and Maceo was always like, you might be racist, you might have issues, but we could come around these two particular figures. And she said that one night, not one member of El Club Atenas showed up. Not one. And so on the stage, it was completely empty. And she said that was their way of saying, we don't want anything to do with you. And so much of the book is getting those oral histories, getting these sources, and then finding a way to write about them in a way that's a narrative. So yeah, that was part of Cubanidad. How do you define Cubanidad with that? If you can't even organize around Martín Maceo, then what? And so on some level, they had to kind of rethink and reshift their own ideas of what it means to be Cuban, especially someone like Melba, who left Cuba in 1936, whose father had to leave earlier because he was protesting against Machado, and they said, if you don't leave, you're going to be killed. So vete ahora. And what was his luck was that he was born in Puerto Rico, so he was a citizen, right, as a result of the Jones Organic Act, and so he could leave, and then he came back for his wife and the kids.
Who else has a question?
Thank you so much for that, Nancy. Really brilliant, really wonderful to see the images as well. I'm curious about the interracial relationships, and what you just said partly answered my question about relations between Black and white Cubans. I'm curious about the Communist Party's role, because it sounds like that was sort of a historical moment when relations between the races became a bit easier. And that I've certainly found that in my research in the US as well. Some skeptics will say, well, the Communist Party, whites in the Communist Party were using Blacks, and so they built interracial possibilities for interracial unity. But really they were opportunistic and just using Blacks. Did you get any sense of that, or could you talk generally about, was it easy or hard to get people to talk about the Communist Party's role?
Well, I didn't speak to anybody. No one was alive who were members of El Club Julio Antonio Mella. But the records, it seemed that because it was an organization, unlike other labor organizations, that was really cultivating immigrants. So if you look at the IW records, there are lodges that are for the Polish, lodges for the Hungarian, and so forth. So the Cervantes Fraternal Society, which I thought was really interesting, I have a quote in the book where Jesus Colón says, the reason we named it after Miguel Cervantes, you're like, whatever, okay, was because everybody speaks Spanish. And that's what organizes us, that's what connects us. And I thought, wow, this is the first kind of definition around Latinidad and the use of language, right, in the 1930s to organize a community. So where they were organizing around was that. These are immigrants that have come from Latin America, from the Caribbean, and all speak Spanish and were organized around that. So race appeared to be secondary to that. It was because the clubs, they all spoke Spanish. So if you look at the records of club, everything's in Spanish. And then also, I talk about it in the book as well, is that the reason the logia gets created, it's very clear in the documents, was that there was no place for Cubans to go who were protesting the Machadato. And so one of the things that the Machadato does, and the protest against the Machadato, is that it brings people of color together. So that just gets translated into New York. Yeah. So no, there wasn't that kind of differences. And I think that's what broke, and again, Melba Alvarado said that the organizers of El Club Cubano Interamericano, the CCI, the 1940s, 1950s, she said, these were old men whose hearts were broken because they had a sense of Cubanidad that was racially mixed, that they were all immigrants, that they were part of the diaspora. And so I gave a talk not too long ago where I said one of the things that this book asks us to do is to theorize what it meant to stay, because there were a lot of Cubans who actually stayed. They did not all go back to the island, and how that looked like. And part of that staying was to create communities that were racially integrated. And then post-World War II, with the Red Scare, with the Taft-Hartley Act, with the Walter McCarran Act, where people were being sent back for their political views, really scared many Cubans. And I think for a lot of white Cubans, they said, we don't want anything to do with this. We're going to move this way. And then after the Cuban Revolution, which I was like, Mel was like, you need to write about this. I said, I got to stop somewhere. I got 100 years under my belt here. But that was probably one of the most bitter times for the clubs, because the exiles who were leaving Cuba at that time were the elite, anti-communist, and felt that any club that was organized before the revolution was suspect. They couldn't trust it. So the irony of all that. Yeah.
Is there any religious dimension to your research? Catholicism, Protestantism, African folk religion, and even perhaps Judaism, given the number of Jews who emigrated to Cuba before the war from Eastern Europe?
Not at that level, but there is some part of work, especially with the CCI. So one of the things that Cubans love is La Caridad del Cobre, which is our patron saint of Cuba. And so they would have masses for La Caridad del Cobre. And so Catholicism was really important. And so I tell a story where this was a moment. There were certain moments around being Cuban that were sacred, right? And Jose Marti was sacred. Everybody could come around Jose Marti, right? He supposedly transcended race, not always. And one was also La Caridad del Cobre, right? You could have they would have a misa, a mass at the church up in Harlem, because this was all in Harlem, by the way. And Alvarado said to me once, he was doing an interview, she said, one day we would always do this misa, and it was racially integrated, and everything was fine, and then one day it just wasn't. And nobody told us. And he said the white Cubans ended up having their own mass, and we found out afterwards that this was just going to separate. So that was one where Catholicism, as a result of Cubanidad, that particular idea gets questioned and challenged. Also, their first bylaw of the CCI is not only that we don't talk about politics in the club, right, because they're distancing themselves from the past organizing and activism of Rumella, but we also don't talk about religion. And the reason, and that one, I could not get people to talk about that. But I did get some sense that the reason for that was really there was this idea that Afro-Cubans practice Santeria, just much like voodoo, that if you practice Santeria, that you are somehow savage, right? It's a savage religion, and it's not. And so as a way to allow people to practice their religion and not to be in any way confronted or having to deal with any issues, they just kept that out of the club. So those are the main points in terms of religion. I didn't find anything around Judaism except for Rumella, where they did organize with a lot of Jewish organizers at that time too. Yeah.
Who else has a question?
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
For your presentation and talking. At the beginning, you were talking about archival hauntings, and I'm always really fascinated by this because I also do archival work, and I always find there to be a strangeness.
Yeah.
And I often phrase it as archival strangers. I'm working with people that are no longer with us. Yeah. And I'm telling their stories, and you had said something about, this really was you learning about you and learning about them, and you're going to tell this story. Were there moments when you were in the archives where there was just a strangeness, and if you could talk about that and what that experience was like? I mean,
see the strangeness, right?
I know,
Yeah.
but can you talk about the strangeness of doing archival work in something that is in this diaspora space, you know?
Absolutely. In fact, it's so funny because I always do this. I always write a talk that's very highly theoretical and gives all kinds of analysis, and then I don't use it. This is the third time that I did that. But in there, and you're absolutely right. And I love the archive. It's very meditative, but it's scary. It's really scary. And so, to get to your point, and how do you theorize it? It was called, the first chapter, or the introduction, talks about diasporic histories and archival hauntings. How do we write about a population that is unknowable, right? Because El Glumella is basically erased from all the CCI records, right? They don't want us to know about that. How do you write about a history that's unthinkable? When I would tell people, I'm writing a history and this and this and this and happened, they didn't believe it. They're just, that didn't happen. The Cuban flag was stitched in New York. I said, yeah, there's actually 3 different stories. What are you talking about, And Cirilio Villaverde, who wrote Cecilia Valdez, which is the most famous Cuban novel, gets written in New York, right? And his wife. So there's all these things where people kept saying, that's unthinkable. But so I was writing this to answer your question. This is one of my favorite Melba Alvarado quotes, and it's in Spanish because I could not translate this if I wanted to. And she said, bueno, mija, apúrate con este trabajo, con estas entrevistas, porque nos estamos poniendo viejos y unos cuantos ya se han muerto. Y la historia, bueno, ¿qué puedo decir? La historia se nos va. And what that says is like, my daughter, please hurry up with this work, with these interviews, because some of us are getting old, and some of us have even died. Like, no pressure there. Like, hurry with the work. We're dying, and what can I tell you? Y la historia, bueno, the history. What can I tell you? The history leaves us. So I thought, what did it mean to write a history that was so temporal, right, that it could leave us if we didn't write it? Because she knew it wasn't in the archive. And so one of the threads in the book is literally, and it's a very highly theoretical book, like you read it and you're going to be like, oh, Professor Mirabal, I know, is the role of the archive at all times. And so Cirilo Villaverde's wife, Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, who's a very interesting figure. She's a white, wealthy Cuban who just pisses off everybody. I loved writing about her. But she has her husband write her memoirs because she is going to will herself into history. She's married to a writer, and she knows that this is how it works. You got to write your own biography, right? You got to write your own text if you're going to be in history. So she gets her husband to do this. And then she says it's anonymous. And everybody's like, yeah, right, it's anonymous. And he says all these amazing things about her, and they're like, yeah, okay, right. But I love that. And here's another quote for you by Richard T. Greener, who was actually a dean in Howard School, at Howard, at the law school, and a very good friend of Henry Highland Garnet. Henry Highland Garnet dies, and this is what he writes. He says, how can the Negro be remembered when such speeches are not to be found in the National Library? And that's in 1882. So they know, right? These figures know that unless they write their own sources, they'll be erased. And Teófilo Dominguez does that. There's a lot of sources here where I kind of play with that. And that's where I play with the archive. Number one, what does it mean to not be there? But also, what does it mean to know that you're not going to be there, and therefore you have to write yourself in? And even then, still be ignored, because people wrote about this period, and I'm like, okay, we got a couple of sources that you could have looked at, but nobody wanted to touch it. So I think the archive, as I read in the book, it's, I might have it for you. It's basically the place that you need to look at. How can I say this? You have to, without getting too theoretical, no, Michel de Certeau, Hayden White, Homi Bhabha, you have to make friends with fragmentation and crevices. You have to allow that to play. You have to allow yourself to not be wedded to periodization or chronology. And as I tell folks, to write this book, I had to use intellectual history, labor history, social history, literary history, comparative. I had to do ethnic studies, Chicana feminism, African American history. I had to do whatever I could in my toolbox to basically get this story together. But yeah, I think the archive is, there are some hauntings, and there's sometimes when you find something, like I found that photo of El Glumella, where I was like, oh man, now there's a different story that needs to be told. Thank you for the question, that was a good one. Thank you. I think you have a question?
Oh, yes. So you had mentioned the term diasporic blancamiento,
Yeah.
and I had only heard it one other time years ago in
Really? 'Cause I
relation
thought I made it up.
to
Okay.
yeah, in relation to the context was for Brazil, but I had never heard it for Cuba. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific socio-political events that really triggered this blancamiento in Cuba?
Well, it's happening in New York. That's why it's diasporic. So the blancamiento, el movimiento de blancamiento, the movement for whitening, is really under José Antonio Sacco. And so what you have on the island is that you have Cubans who are saying, okay, for instance, José Antonio Sacco was a philosopher, and he gets exiled from Cuba for his writing and his thinkings. And people think, oh, this is great, revolution. No, no, no. So he gets exiled. He wants to end slavery, but he doesn't think slavery makes economic sense, but he wants to find a way to get rid of Afro-Cubans. And so he believes in whitening. And he says in intermarriage and anything possible to kind of whiten the population. And so the idea was very clear, this idea of tu blanquear. I mean, it happened in Argentina, right, with Sarmiento. It was a very common idea and theory, was that the notion of whiteness is being superior to anything else. And so the reason I talk about diasporic blancamiento is that as Cubans were coming, these are the elites, and they are kind of writing about how are we going to whiten Cuba. And also talking about slavery, because slavery doesn't end in Cuba, ends in Cuba in about 1882, 83. Brazil is the last country to abolish slavery in the 1890s. And so Cuba is one of the last bastions for slavery. So it's an issue that pretty much obsesses many white Cubans. Not so much how do we end slavery, but what do we do with an island that has so many free people of color, that has so many different mixtures and races? How do we make this a white island? And those anxieties transfer to New York. One way they transfer is that those people who are organizing New York, and you can read about them, Santa Cilia, Cuquieria, all these people, is that they think that possibly annexing the island to the United States is one of the ways that they can whiten it. Right? So there's this big movement around annexation. And it's literally annexation of the island to the United States that causes most of the tensions between Cubans themselves. Some people want independence, some want annexation, and other people still want to have a relationship with Spain. They were known as autonomous. So that's where it comes about, this idea. But it was impossible because the United States did not think of Cubans as white, right? They saw them as racialized as well.
Question? Ask a question. Anybody? Could I ask a question about,
Yeah.
it's kind of fascinating that there's all this publishing going on in New York.
Yeah.
Could you say, you mentioned that you had some newspapers, could you say a little bit more about the kind of dimensions of publication by Cubans in New York?
Well, not only by Cubans, by all immigrant groups, right? So there's newspapers by a number of immigrant groups. New York becomes the center of newspapers, books, publication. Anybody in there who wants to get famous, who wants to write, goes to New York to do that. And we know that the earliest Cuban newspaper was 1823. It was called El Habanero, and it was published by Father Felix Varela. So Varela leaves Cuba in about the 1820s, 1823, and that's why I begin the book in 1823, because he's the beginning of what we know as a Cuban exile, right, a political exile, and creates a certain community. And so after El Habanero, every single community that comes to New York publishes newspapers. And they publish newspapers because that is the quickest way to get their ideas out there. And it's this incredible, it's almost like social media now, right? It's the quickest way to get their information out there, to create community, to get their ideas. And then you have competing papers and so forth. And thank goodness they wrote, because now they're in the archive and we can read them and use them. So yeah, I'm not sure why it was New York, what was going on in New York, but it was really in Manhattan, New York. And also it's the rise of the black press as well. And they get black press, I think, as early as the 1820s as well. And they're also really interesting newspapers around Cuba and immigrants and so forth. And also the Spanish-American War, for those is actually the first war. It's not only the first war that the United States fight outside of its first empire, outside of the mainland. It's also the first war where African Americans are drafted to fight. And it's in that war where African Americans kind of come face to face with Afro-Cubans, and the newspapers are fascinating around this idea of like, why are we fighting this war, this colonial war for the United States, and why are we oppressing people who look like us? And it's really an amazing
There was a feeling in Vietnam too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, yeah.
So, precursor. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. And as I mentioned to you before, I am Cuban descent. I'm first generation Cuban American. And I just want to touch a little bit about the term blanqueamiento, because I have a little different spin on it in terms of, oral history from my family. And one of the things that's often talked about in the Cuban community is adelantar la raza, and quien no tiene Congo tiene Carabelli, which basically implies the fact that there are Cubans that, quote unquote, look white, but are not white. And they assimilate more to those that are in power. Can you speak a little bit about that, regarding that? Because, when I hear the term blanqueamiento, I agree with what you said, but there's also this other spin about the truth that, there's another phrase what is it?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Where's your grandmother, basically?
Where's your grandmother?
Which is
in the closet, yeah.
Right, in the closet, exactly. So if you could speak a little bit about that,
Yeah.
I'll be interested to hear your perspectives.
Absolutely. That's the legacy of all of these issues around race, right?
Mm-hmm.
Early on. And I'll be teaching one next semester. I teach courses on Afro-Latinidades, right? And I go back to the different slave systems in Latin America and in the hemisphere, and that part of it was really creating this discourse, whether it's the castas in Mexico, and the Caribbean has also definitions of whiteness where you have like 30 to 40 definitions, trigueña, mulata, pardo, all of these just to say like the different gradations of color. Really comes out of a slave system where the children of the women who had been raped by the slave masters were free. And so they kind of create a free people of color. And they had a little bit more power than those who were still enslaved. And so right there you get that relationship between whiteness and mobility, whiteness and freedom. And so this idea that whiteness actually has currency, privilege, and so forth. So why would you go back? Adelantar la raza means, you better marry lighter because you're going to take the race forward, or atrasar la raza, right? And so that there's all this meaning around blackness and whiteness that is really fascinating. And I was looking at that. We know that in the Caribbean and Latin America, but how was that being manifested in New York, where you have African Americans? And there was this moment where I thought it was really incredible. The Cuban Anti-Slavery Society gets organized after emancipation in the United States in 1872. And what is interesting about that, African Americans are actually envious of Afro-Cubans. Because that Céspedes, once he frees his slaves, he said, if you fight this war, the 10 Years' War, you will all be Cuban. And so that Cubans of African descent are allowed to be part of the nation state. They're allowed to be Cuban in ways that African Americans are never allowed to be part of the nation state. There is no particular moment where they say, okay, you're American and you can never have that race. Here was the possibility, now did it happen? But at least there was this rhetorical kind of idea that if I fight this war, that if I do these things, yo soy cubano como todo el mundo, right? And you still see that in the island. Doesn't matter if people's backgrounds and so forth, they still say, yo soy cubana, yo soy cubano. And that should be enough, right? So that this idea of cubanidad is really fascinating, and that's why I put it in the center, because it allowed me to look at all those contradictions and conflicts. But you're absolutely right, we still deal with it today. We still see it in the Dominican Republic, we see it in many of the islands, in Argentina, in Venezuela, Colombia, where people don't realize that there's a large African-descended population, same in Mexico, and even in Central America.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Time for one more question. Have we? All right. Okay. Well, we should probably thank Professor Mirabal.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Fascinating talk.